Thank you very much to Sadia. Lots to ponder on there, lots to reflect on. So now we are in a position where we would like to bring on one of our panelists, just for a little bit of a response to some of the insights Sadia shared. Could I please welcome Alan Bajani from Maf Holdings, Majid Al Futtaim Holdings, just to quickly respond to some of those insights. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage. Welcome, Alan. Please feel free to take a seat anywhere. So, we just had a fantastic speech from Sadia touching on, a huge range of things from, the future of the workforce, the green transition. Now, with your organization, you're seeing a lot of this come into play. What were some of your reflections on these topics from Sadia's speech?
I think what Sadia said is extremely relevant, and that's something that we're living every day. And I have here to applaud the work that the World Economic Forum is putting together with Dubai Cares and other stakeholders in order to really find a way to make education relevant going forward, and also make sure that the future of work is not just a theme or I would say a headline, but actually a reality that we work. How can we make sure that we promote and that we actually graduate young people that would be relevant in the new workplace, and how can we as a private sector welcome them properly and give them the tools, the needs, the framework and the environment for them to be able to thrive. And this is an effort that actually both the private and the public sector and the civil society where they have to come together to make it happen. Absolutely. So when you think about the relevant themes going forward, the green transition, the future of work, all of these things, what does it mean? It means that on the one side, we really have to question and be clear about how are we going to do business going forward, and what are the skill sets that are relevant going forward. And this means that we need to engage with education and much early on than what we usually do from, I would say, a private sector standpoint.
Absolutely, agreed. Just on that point, because at Majid Al Futtaim, you're doing so much, and I wonder whether you can actually share, because I think one of the challenges with this discussion is it often stays very ephemeral, very academic, very theoretical. Can you share some of the practical things that you're doing in support of building the skills of the younger generation, and even some of the older generation as well, because they need skill updates too?
Yeah. So the reality is we are a generation. I mean, we're blessed and cursed to be a generation that need to transition the world. And this is something that I've always said. Our generation of leaders are the ones that really need to move the world from the analog era to a digital era. I know this is something that started 2 years back, and it will take, I think, a decade, one more decade ahead of us. Our children, the youth that are now coming into the workforce are mostly digital natives. And their issues are very different than what they have. But the reality is we still have a whole workforce that we need to transition in order to succeed in preparing the world for those who are there. So you have the generation or the two generation of leaders that are currently in the workforce, the ones that are in the core of it and the ones that are about to exit the workforce. These are the ones that need to transition. The new ones coming in, they get it better than we do. So it's our role to do this transition. And to do this transition, we have to support people in feeling relevant. And what do I mean by that? One of the biggest problems going forward is that we're moving from an era where the value of an individual was driven by the past achievements that he or she have done, yes, and the capabilities that he or she have acquired, to a world where the value of an individual is actually primarily driven by what he or she can contribute going forward. Absolutely. That's very different from what he or she can actually have done in the past. So whenever any one of us here in the audience describe our relevance or what can we do or who we are, we talked a lot about what we have done in the past. But that's irrelevant because we're not going to repeat that in the future. So this is a big mindset shift in being able to understand and being able to comprehend that our value is how much we can learn and how much we can contribute, and not what we have done, as great as it might be. This means that we need to educate people differently. Yes. We need a value system that's different. We need to understand that, for example, getting a promotion is not anymore the result of previous success,
Indeed.
but future potential. And that's very different. And this, of course, Sadia touched on it, in the context of jobs that are going to move into roles, because most of the jobs are going to be taken over by technology, but each one of us will have a bigger role to play, whether within a team or within an organization or within an environment. So people knowing that the future is about the role they play, not the job they do, because something else or someone else, technology is going to take over that doing part, and there is the actual contribution, the role that you play that's going to come into the future is also very, very important. The last point is the fact that we have a great transition within this green transition. So we've got the technological shift, the tectonic shift that are happening, and now the imperative for a green transition. And a lot of the jobs, I think the WEF have quantified that at about 85 million jobs that will need to transition in the coming 10 years.
85 million. Yeah.
That's a lot of jobs that needs to transition. And the biggest impediment to succeed this transition is people really understanding that this is not, I would say, a statement about their inability. It's actually a statement about their ability. And this is why Majid Al-Futtaim have started the leadership, our Leadership Institute, in order to support people in their individual leadership development. Because if we are not able to look at the future and be able to lead ourselves into that future without feeling that the future is a proof of what is required in the future, is a proof that we are not relevant anymore, because what we used to do, what we know what to do, is not what's going to take us there, and it's more about what we can learn, we'll always be resistant to change.
Absolutely.
And the biggest problem is this resistance to change.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And to extract from what Alan helpfully said, what got us here is not what will take us there. And I think that's really, a crucial point, that people often think past success will guarantee the future success. But in this new ecosystem of the future of work, that's by no means certain. Alan, just before we let you go, I just want to understand that, given that there's lots going on, governments, educational institutions, trying to really enrich the workforce of the future, employers of all sizes are going to be the biggest beneficiaries of that. So what responsibilities to and partnerships with do organizations really have to radically reimagine to actually go beyond just 20th century style work placements and apprenticeships? What other things can business, private sector business, be doing like yours?
Well, look, I am of the view that the biggest role in this regard is the role of the private sector and of individual corporation, because you've got multiple stakeholders. You've got civil society, you've got the education system, you've got governments. All of them are trying to really understand what's going to be the future of work. But primarily the private sector and the business, I would say, sector at large, is the one that's really responsible about defining the future of work. So everyone is partaking in this reflection and trying to really understand what it is. Government is trying to imagine the future of government, et cetera, et cetera. But these enablers that are the education system that happens within the civil society are trying to respond to that equation. But the main stakeholder is the private sector, and the private sector has a huge responsibility to define the future of work, has a huge responsibility to say, I don't know, because it's okay if we don't know. Okay?
Agreed,
a lot of
agreed.
us don't know. And we need to be ready to a future that may not be always very clear. It's difficult for business leaders to say, I don't know. That's our biggest problem. We think we know everything, and it's difficult for corporations to say what actually got us here is not going to take us there. So there has to be a very important, I would say, partnership and working together. And I think this is where the work that WEF leads is very important, a platform that brings people together. And in very simple and empirical terms, think about what the future of work is going to be and is going to necessitate, and how can we do it and improve on it and correct over time, because no one has a magic formula. And the challenge there boils down to cost. Business want government to pay for it. Government want business to pay for it because business is going to make the money out of it.
It's always the question, who settles the bills?
Exactly.
Classic.
So there's always this issue about who settles the bill and who's going to temporarily take the burden off the shoulder. So business would tell you globally, well, that's the government problem because they have to make sure that people are capable of finding jobs. That's not our issue. We're going to offer jobs. People are either ready for them or not. But strategically, it is our issue, because if we do not have the most important asset that is sharpened and ready to lead in this future, we're going to lose. And government will lose, and people will lose. So we have to turn a lose-lose situation into a win-win situation.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I think we've got a lot to ponder on there, and we'll definitely be talking about the funding, the finance question, who settles the bill, because it's crucial. The future of work is not necessarily going to pay for itself. But for now, Alan, I just want to thank you.
Thank you very much.
I want to just share as well all the wonderful things that Majid Al Futtaim is doing. So please go to their website, check out what they're innovating, because it is a model for what private sector can do and how they can define the future of work. Please join me in giving a joyful thanks to Alan for his contribution.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Now, without further ado, into the main event, to our panel discussion. Please join me in welcoming on our panelists onto the stage, His Excellency Ayman, Lady Mariam, and Ewan Wilhurst, to discuss in more detail what the future of work will look like and how we move from play to pay. Thank you.
Where do you want us?
Oh, you can sit anywhere. Wonderful. Now, I always like to just test out the microphones, test out the sound systems. So can we go down the panel? Can you briefly introduce yourselves and share one thing that most excites you about being here at the fantastic Rewired Summit today? So we'll start with His Excellency.
Thank you very much. Well, the one thing, as far as I'm concerned, is the fact that we're listening to different perspectives. We're listening to the government's perspective, we're listening to the private sector, we're listening to the NGO, and for the very first time, I think for quite a while now, we're getting the sort of the cross-pollination happening in real time. So that's very exciting for us.
I completely agree. I love all the ideas just floating up into the air and hopefully sparking something exciting. To you, Lady Mariam, what's one thing that most excites you about being here today?
Wow, thanks for having me. What is exciting me is that I am a coder, so I can tell everyone about coding today.
Wonderful, wonderful. And Ewan, can you just quickly share your most exciting feeling or thought about being here?
I can. I mean, first, just being at a physical conference for the first time in 2 years,
So
I think
true.
is significant. But I have to say, having the word play as the Lego Foundation in the title of this plenary shows how much the discussions around learning and education have already come on.
Fantastic. And I think, hopefully for all of you, you can start thinking about things that you're finding most exciting about being here. But let's jump straight into it. I've myself mentioned the phrase, the future of work, a lot of times already. But this is a concept that can often feel very vague, vast, variable. So maybe, Your Excellency, could you just help us define what this concept actually means? And what are some of the challenges that it poses for the nature of skills and work?
Yeah, sure. Well, the future of work, as far as we're concerned, is much more performance-based than time-paced. I think we've been through a generation now, we've been through 20 years, 30 years, more than a generation, where most work was time-intensive. In the future, as far as we're concerned, or at least what we're designing for, is much more performance-based knowledge application, much more performance-based KPIs, and so on, and much less time-based. And so as far as we're concerned, the future of work is very clearly linked and correlates very directly with deliverables. And so to do that, I guess you need to reverse engineer the skill sets that are required. You need to reverse engineer the dynamic that you're going to need to make sure that that works.
I love that. It's about the product that comes out at the end, not just the presence.
Exactly.
So it's really trying to get to that value delivery. I can see both of you nodding. Feel free to jump in. I don't know whether we have any alternative definitions on the panel.
I mean, for me, I will probably touch on the inclusion side. For me, the future of work, that's why I love what the Lego Foundation does. I run the I Am the Code Foundation, which is now in 70 countries. And I remember in 2016, when we founded the I Am the Code, many people couldn't talk about play and coding. So I'm a full stack developer. So I'm the testimony of the future of work, because many young people across the world will not have access to expensive education. So I think one of the things we should talk about today is education is very expensive. And not my girls, I work with 28,000 girls right now across the world. Not every single young girl will have an MBA, a PhD, or expensive education that many people in this room have today. And I learned how to code 7 coding languages in my local library in Guildford in Surrey. And today I'm a full stack developer. I spend my time coding and looking into the future of AI and cybersecurity. So I think that the inclusion part for me is the future of work. That's why I love what Sadia said earlier in how do you make sure that refugees, 80 million refugees across the world, young girls living in favelas, in slums of Nairobi, in Nigeria, all across the world, we are considering these people as the leftovers. So it's something I call the education leftover. So we can educate everyone except the refugees or the young girls like me who grew up from Senegal. I didn't have any education. I mean, in 1990s, if you ask me that I'll be sitting here today talking to you or talking to all these people, it's unbelievable. But one of the things we should think about, and I really want everyone who are in this summit to think about in 2030, what are we looking for? Are we looking for coders, developers? Who's going to hire them? Who's going to make sure that we are talking about inclusion? Because technology has no gender, no age, no race, no color. As long as the young girls can have connectivity, infrastructure, they can learn how to code, they can be sitting here like me in 2030 talking to you.
Fantastic. No, and absolutely. I think that is definitely something that deserves a bit of an applause. You and actually, I just want to come to you because, you know, in all this discussion, coding and, you know, thinking about cognitive product, it all sounds very serious. But coming from the Lego Foundation, there's got to be this idea of play. And one thing that often does get overlooked in the upskilling and reskilling conversation is fun and enjoyment. You know, people talk about it more as a sort of, you know, reluctantly performed chore. So how do we infuse a lifelong love and enjoyment of learning into this reskilling and upskilling cycle?
I think that's key as well. We talk about the future of work. The future of work starts right now. And I think that's really important. And it starts with early childhood. That's often what's missed, I think, in the reskilling debate as well. We'd have to do less reskilling if we focused in early childhood on exactly that. It seems to me that, you know, education right now is all just around this sprint or this race for children to head across predetermined hurdles in an inflexible time frame. Yeah. And that no one's going to love doing that. So I think really rethinking the purpose of education around that, around how do we create that agile, passionate, socially, emotionally balanced and creative workforce of the future has to start in the early childhood years.
Interesting. And I think that touches a little bit on what Alan, our previous interviewee, said, that, you know, private sector has to get far more involved far earlier. So it's exciting to see that sort of interplay. Your Excellency, can I come back to you? Because, you know, we're hearing all of this lovely stuff, but we need to get really practical. You know, what is it that we need to practically do to empower individuals to be able to transition from yesterday's jobs to the jobs of the future, and ideally at the same speed that AI and other frontier technologies are evolving? What needs to happen?
So as far as we're concerned, if you look at, number one, preparing the landscape, both from the labor force and from the employer's perspective, and of course from the educator's perspective. Historically, what we used to do is we used to have sort of legacy accreditation. We would then go to the labor force, and then from the labor force see where we could plug and play these individuals. Again, like I said previously, now we're just simply reverse engineering the whole system. What we're looking at doing is recognizing, number one, what skills are required for particular jobs. Number two, reverse engineering the accreditation. So we're now talking about micro modules. We're talking about micro accreditation. We're talking about very quick, high-speed sort of upskilling. We're talking about upskilling through gamification, like you both spoke about. Play, exactly. And then finally, we're talking about signaling as well. Because what we're finding, at least in government, is that there is a lag between the signal that the market provides to the labor force and the uptake from the labor force. Right, so what we're trying to do is we're trying to create platforms that can identify very quickly to the end users, to students, to individuals that are up for upskilling. If they were to gain that skill, If they were to gain that micro-accreditation, what would open, what opportunities are open to them, and then what sorts of financial benefits. That way, at least, we can get the feedback, I think, much faster.
That's fantastic, that sort of alignment, because there needs to be a dynamism.
Exactly.
At the moment, you start a course, and by the end of your degree or your training accreditation, you find that you're not really sure where you're going with it or whether it's even still relevant. So that kind of dynamism is quite exciting. I just wonder, Minister, are there any sort of legislative changes or specific other policies that you're doing to encourage more of this type of innovation? Because this sort of thing is exciting, and we need more of it.
So I'll tell you what we're doing in Bahrain. So we call it the Tertiary Action Plan. Okay, so the Tertiary Action Plan really is an educational revolution. We really are revisiting every single element within the education apparatus. So number one, I mentioned signaling. So we've got this database, effectively, that's called the Employability Skills Portal. So the Employability Skills Portal allows every single student to come in and to assess what is in the market, number one, what's available, and it also forecasts in the future what jobs are available. Number two, how much do they pay? Number three, the difference between your current skill sets and the skill sets that job requires. Number four, what sort of micro skills can you do? Either you do it online, or we call it recognition, or everybody, I think at this point, calls it recognition of prior learning. So we don't mind, we don't care whether you've picked it up from YouTube, whether we picked it up from Coursera, whether you picked it up from an internship, and so on and so forth. Our job is to recognize the learning, recognize that you have the knowledge, and recognize that you can apply it. And then hit the ground running. So what that effectively does is very similar to what we've seen with very large companies, very large multinationals, is that we're assessing and accrediting the capability to do it, as opposed to assessing the amount of time that was allocated to that. And so just to answer your question, that means that we need flexible learning. That means that we need micro-credentials. That also means that we need to change the role of government. We're moving from an operator model to an operator, to a regulator and a facilitator model. And the reason why, as well, is because, like we heard previously, the private sector does it much faster. And at this time, with the pandemic, post-pandemic, we're not talking about my country, we're talking about the whole world. I think everybody's on borrowed time. And so, as far as we're concerned, the faster we can catch up, the better it is for everyone.
And having been to Bahrain myself, I'm actually seeing the results of this, Minister, so whatever you're doing, it's working. And I love this idea of government being dynamic, as dynamic or even more dynamic than the private sector. Lady Mariam, what the Minister mentioned is quite interesting, because it feels like it's sort of breaking up the cartel that very formal education used to have, that sort of monopoly on accreditation and officialdom. Just out of interest, what are the other ways in which our educational system, universities, schools, training colleges, what are the other ways that they haven't been making the grade? What are the ways in which they've been failing, especially some of the young women that you mentioned in those leftover parts of the world?
I mean, the policymakers are now making a difference, because I think there's a wake-up call with COVID-19. They realize they've left their young people behind. And so for one of the things I've learned, when COVID-19 started, I've been begging government for 25 years to bring technology in favelas, in slums, in places of misery, and we are all, there's a collective amnesia. We just expect that these young girls and boys growing up, like me, will just wake up and just have access to Lego or have access to big companies. It's not going to work. So someone has to actually do the work. So that's why I didn't need to create I Am the Code, which is now in 70 countries, from Japan to Brazil.
Fantastic.
Because the policymakers failed to actually educate young girls and boys, but also failed to bring technology and innovation and very simple methodologies to do that. And now they realize, oh my God, 2030 is coming. We have 8 years to go. What are we going to do with these young people? So at the World Economic Forum, I work with Sadia and her team. We bought the taxonomy of digital skills and work. Now, if you are a government, a digital minister in a government today in 2021, before 2022, if you haven't thought about working with Lego, remember, the reason why Lego works is because we are traumatized children. I didn't go to school, so I was abandoned as a child. So trauma, is actually affecting today refugees, boys and girls, growing up all across the world. If your mother and father don't have money, don't have access to private schools, forget about it. You're not going to make it. So I think we need to make sure policymakers today, they change their policies and focus purely on inclusion, but at the same time focus on technology where every single child is not left behind, and work with I Am the Code or any other organization, give young boys and girls the tools they need. So in 2030, when we are designing the Sustainable Development Goals or standing at the United Nations, applauding ourselves because we have made it, refugees can come and say, I learned how to code. A young girl from favela can come and say that. A young girl growing up in a council estate in the United Kingdom where thousands of girls are digitally illiterate. We're not even thinking about that. So I think that, my call today in this conference, which is Rewired, and I think Tariq talks about this all the time, is how do you make sure that boys and girls all across the world are included into our decision-making processes. At the same time, we need to make sure that we fund education. We've been talking about education funding for 50 years. I'm 47 years old, by the way.
You don't look it, so
no,
it's
seriously.
fine.
And we need to think about how do we fund education. Put the money, give it to the people. Let's build the solutions. Let's work with Lego Foundation. Because when girls are traumatized and boys, Lego Foundation actually help them play and they help them be confident. So I'm just trying to make sure that we look after people. And
Just
we care
on
for
that
them.
point, Lady Mariam, I'm actually going to loop you in because actually, all the things that the Minister, Lady Mariam, has talked about, they're all brilliant, but they're going to need huge amounts of funding and investment. And so what I want to understand is, what have you seen, heard, or perhaps even initiated at the Lego Foundation to ensure that the future of education, this innovative education, is accessible and affordable for some of our most disadvantaged young children?
And I think it comes down to the fact that whole systems need to reform. I mean, if we look at the fact that, I think you said, Your Excellency, that the private sector, the advances we've seen in medicine, finance and everything, education systems are fundamentally still education systems that are fit for the industrial age rather than now. And with that, I think becomes a responsibility of all of us that benefit from education. I know that before COVID, frighteningly, the Education Commission said that 800 million children and young people would not have the skills needed. And we can only imagine now what that looks like post-COVID when so many have been excluded as well. So I think there's a responsibility on all of us, whether that's governments, it's private philanthropy, actually to be more joined up in modernizing a whole systems approach. Too often we're all pursuing our own agendas and our own micro targets rather than coming together. I happen to sit on the board of the Global Partnership for Education representing private philanthropy. And there's an example, I think, of where everybody is starting to come together and say, we can't do this. We've got to have country-led plans that are focused on the skills that are needed. And we talk the skills that you're talking, but also what use to a young girl to have coding skills if she hasn't got resilience, creativity, if she hasn't got the social emotional learning. So it's for all of us now to come together, and it shouldn't be difficult.
No, sure.
We all have the answers between us, yet we somehow fail to come together and get the systems reform we need.
Easier said than done from the sounds of things.
I think this is why it's important to have the coalition of the willing. I think we need to have the coalition of the willing for education. Everyone should really say, do I want to see my child not going to school or not having an education? I think when we start thinking about the human aspect, then I think we can start really investing, because there are millions. I see misery in education, and it's really not good in 2021, right? So I think if we're going to talk about this SDG number 4, how are we going to make sure that in 2030, you and I will stand at the United Nations to say, the refugees have education. Coursera is doing an amazing work. Over 9,500 courses, our girls have access to it. But we need to look into our side and say, what is the humanity we need to make sure that boys and girls are not left behind? And until we think about this way, it's not going to happen, because there's no point girls growing up in favelas of Nigeria, of Brazil, in slums of Kenya. My girls right now, they're sitting from South Sudan, Somalia, Burundi, Kinshasa. They're in a refugee camp, over 200,000 refugees. They have education, of course, but it's limited. So, but you need to visualize 2030 and say, what's going to happen if I invest right now into young girl? Because if you invest right now to 11 years old girl, in 2030 you'll see your return of investment.
Best return on investment you can. Best
Absolutely.
return on investment, investing in the education of young people. Minister, actually, if you don't mind, I want to come to you and loop you into this conversation, and specifically thinking about girls, because it's undisputed that with the digitalization of the world economy, women young girls, they are enjoying far better educational and work opportunities. However, the pandemic has actually shown that that's all quite fragile, because we've all seen and read about the ways in which females are exiting the labor force during this last 18 or so months. So Minister, Your Excellency, I just want to kind of pick your brains about how do we secure sustainable inclusion of women, females in the education and workforce of the future?
Sure, absolutely. Look, from our perspective, it's opportunities, right? Access to opportunities. And when we say opportunities, we cannot, should not ever restrict the opportunities to a particular type of opportunity. I think we talk about workforce of the future or work of the future. The work of the future doesn't need to look like today's work. It doesn't need to mean that I mean, we've seen this with COVID. We've seen this during this period. It doesn't mean that you need to be on a desk. It doesn't need to be in an office. It can be anywhere doing anything. I mean, we've got plenty of young female coders, for example, that can work from anywhere. And so as far as we're concerned, my key concern would be with regards to measuring the information.
Right.
Let's just make sure that when we say that individuals are unemployed, we need to assess whether or not they're contracted to do coding, for example, and make sure that these numbers come in. Because from our perspective, when we reach out to a large population, as far as our young females are concerned, a lot of them do have an income. A lot of them have a sustainable income. A lot of them have a very good sustainable income. And a lot of them have been able to hack the system where they would access international markets. Markets that far surpass anything that we can provide them. And so the beauty is that if you can measure it correctly, then you can identify it. But I think our job really is empowerment. Empowerment through providing them with the skill sets that they require, empowerment through shedding light on the fact that that sort of workforce is available, and it's flexible, it's capable, and it's productive. And then in the end, it's sort of bridging, putting platforms to allow them to bridge the opportunity and the skill sets.
Fantastic, and I really love that point about measuring very carefully, because as we all know, what gets measured often gets managed so much better. So that's a really kind of insightful, incisive point. Thank you, Your Excellency. Ewan, actually, I just want to loop you in, because with the Lego Foundation as well, you have this reach. Similarly, what have you seen in terms of that effort to kind of secure the sustainable inclusion of females and particularly young girls? Because Lego, sometimes has been traditionally seen as a sort of boyish pastime, but what are you doing to kind of encourage young girls to get involved?
I mean, I think the first thing that I would say, and I think we'd all agree this, is nowhere near enough. I mean, that's the stark reality for all of us, is no one is doing enough in this space. True. So from that premise, it's really how are we and our partners and the voices of those that we profess to support, how are their voices coming into this? And we're, as a foundation, like many others, going through those difficult, uncomfortable self-challenges around how do we do this more. We've talked for a long time about it's about all children everywhere. But unless we actually identify and realize all children can only be lifted when the most vulnerable, those with the least access. And so we need to look long hard at the systems and ourselves around what does it mean? What does that systemic change mean? Because it isn't just about schools. It isn't just about parenting. It really is about the whole piece. But I think for what we see now, particularly in the pandemic, where schools are closed to so many people, that actually that role of parents and caregivers is becoming even more important, and helping them to understand, particularly when they're bringing up girls, how important it is to give them the access they need to play, frankly, to be able to understand that play is not frivolous. It's critical. The evidence shows that. That's how skills are developed. It's how that breadth of skills and confidence of resilience. So we need to challenge ourselves to do better.
Absolutely. Lady Mariam, I want to loop you back in, because you mentioned a really interesting point that, undoubtedly the pandemic has been devastating for so many, but, looking for that silver lining, desperately looking for it, what are some of the more positive effects that we've seen on the future of work or its evolution because of the pandemic? Ewan mentioned that, parents and caregivers are stepping up into prominence. What other positive things have we seen in these last 18 or so months?
I mean, I'm very hopeful, because I think, like I said, COVID-19 has really shaken the systems and kind of like really brought us back to our own humanity as human beings. My son is 20 years old, and I think about the opportunity he has in the United Kingdom. But at the same time, when I go back to Africa and I meet these boys and girls all across the world who are so desperate to have just literacy and numeracy, basic literacy and numeracy they don't have. They don't have computers, they don't have connectivity infrastructure. And I think one of the Rewired has done, and I know that Tariq and I sit on at the Council of Education and Upskilling at the World Economic Forum, and we are pushing the agenda at the World Economic Forum, and at Davos I hope that we will push more even the agenda out there with all of our partners, Lego Foundation included. But I think the positive thing is that the leaders are starting to be awake now. They know they can't leave their people behind. Young people, if you don't look after them, they will look after themselves through social media anyway, so they will go and tell the whole world what's going on. And I think the other thing that is positive for me is that, we now have a certain kind of like taxonomy of conversation. We have boys and, policymakers. Businesses are trying to hire people. As Your Excellency have said, you can sit down in Mombasa right now and you can build an app without no one knowing you are a refugee. A refugee is not written on their back. We are the one that putting all these status. My lack of education, didn't stop me being on this panel today. So I think we need to start thinking about, how do we see each other as human beings, but also how do you make sure that we don't leave people behind? And if we really want to go to the United Nations Declaration of not leaving anyone behind, and as Kofi Annan said in 2013 and 2015 at the United Nations, and we go in 2030, when we sit down and talk about SDG number 4, how are we going to say we taught boys and girls equitable education, everyone has access? I know not everyone will have access, but I think we need to start as human beings, as businesses, to say, I want to make sure the girls in Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, the girls in Dadaab, the girls in favelas of urban Nigeria, all these girls need to have access to education, because if you don't educate a young girl, she will end up getting married, she will end up getting raped, she will end up being molested. And there are so many social issues that we forget about when we talk about education. The play brings the resilience. The play also brings the confidence that the girls are in a safe space, which Sarah Brown is doing very well at the moment. Absolutely.
And just that point, Lady Mariam, I really want to draw out, I completely agree. The pandemic definitely did help us see each other and all of us far more, humanly. I mean, definitely on the Zoom calls when you see, your colleague's little child running up, or, the dog or the cat, as it may be, you realize they're not just a colleague or, a work bot. They're actually a full human. And I completely agree. This pandemic has helped us to see the humanity in each one of us around. So just as we kind of wrap up this panel, I always like to conclude on a somewhat optimistic note. So let's assume that somehow we're zapped into the future. We've taken all the bold steps prescribed for the emergence of a creative, collaborative, and inclusive workforce of the future. Can you each very briefly just share one economic indicator or societal signal that would tell you, yes, we've done it. We have achieved the workforce of the future. We haven't left anyone behind. Everyone is getting the education, the skills that they deserve. One economic indicator. Ewan, I'll start with you, and then we'll work down the panel.
I don't know that there's one, to be honest.
I know it's a tough question, but you have to pick
to
one.
me, it wouldn't necessarily be, I may fudge this slightly, I don't think it would necessarily be an economic indicator. It would be the fact that we would see a genuine reimagination of education systems that enable an environment where those holistic skills can be developed and people can thrive.
Agreed.
I think that would be it for me.
Interesting. Lady Mariam, one economic indicator or societal signal?
Well, I think I agree with, it's 1 million, so we at I Am the Code, we are going to teach 1 million women and girls to learn how to code by 2030, and I'm 28,000, so let's meet together in 2030 at the United Nations where I show you my data, so let's do that.
And finally to you, Your Excellency, one economic indicator or societal signal that we've achieved it.
So from our perspective, the only thing or the main signal that we're measuring is employability. The employability of our individuals very, very simply identifies for us whether the platform that we put in place, whether the legislations that we put in place, whether the policies we put in place are actually working or not. Otherwise, we then understand or identify very quickly the red tape that's keeping people from sort of gaining the skill sets that are required for employability. So for our perspective, our one word really in Bahrain is employability for education.
Very solid economic indicator there, employability. Okay, on that note, that brings us to the very end of this panel session. So thank you all to our wonderful panelists for your brilliant insights, and thank you to you, our audience, for your attendance and attention. We hope that this session has been educational in all senses of the word. So please join me in enthusiastic applause for our brilliant panelists.
Thanks so much.